You learned the date in school. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. You probably even learned the little rhyme. But here is the strange thing. Columbus never set foot on the mainland of North America. He landed on a Caribbean island, believed until the day he died that he had reached Asia, and the continent we now call America was not even named after him. It was named after a different Italian explorer entirely. And that is just the beginning of how wrong this story actually is. Because nearly 500 years before Columbus boarded the Santa Maria, a group of seafarers had already built houses on North American soil. They had already cut timber, forged iron, and buried their dead in graves that archaeologists would not find for almost 1,000 years. They were Norse. You might know them by a different name. Vikings. The story of who actually reached the Americas first is one of the strangest detective stories in modern archaeology, and it begins not with a triumphant discovery, but with a Canadian eel fisherman, a Norwegian husband and wife archaeology team, and a windswept patch of grassy coastline at the very tip of Newfoundland that almost nobody thought was worth investigating. To understand how the Vikings got there, you first need to understand how far they had already traveled. By the late 900s AD, Norse seafarers had pushed westward across the North Atlantic in a chain of increasingly daring voyages. They settled Iceland. From Iceland, a man named Eric the Red, exiled for manslaughter, sailed further west and found a massive, mostly ice-covered landmass that he optimistically named Greenland, a piece of marketing so effective that settlers actually followed him there. Greenland, it turns out, was not the end of the journey. It was the launching point for the next one. According to the Icelandic sagas, oral histories eventually written down centuries later, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing toward Greenland around 985 AD when storms blew him off course. He spotted land to the west, forested and unfamiliar, nothing like the icy coast he expected. He did not stop to explore it. He simply noted its existence and continued on his way, which is either remarkably disciplined or one of the great missed opportunities in human history, depending on how you look at it. The man who actually followed up on Bjarni's sighting was Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif assembled a crew, retraced the route Bjarni had described, and made landfall on a coastline that the sagas describe in three distinct stages. First, a barren, rocky place he called Helgeland, likely part of modern Baffin Island. Then a flat, forested coast he called Markland, likely part of Labrador. And finally, a place with wild grapes growing in such abundance that he named it Vinland, Wineland. For centuries, Vinland was treated by most historians as exactly what it sounds like: a legend. A piece of medieval Norse storytelling layered with exaggeration, much like tales of dragons and trolls that appear elsewhere in the same sagas. Wild grapes growing in North America seemed implausible to scholars who assumed the climate would never have supported them, and without physical evidence, Vinland remained firmly in the category of folklore rather than history. That changed because of two people most professional archaeologists of the time refused to take seriously. Helge Ingstad was a Norwegian explorer and writer, not a credentialed academic, which made the establishment skeptical of his theories from the start. His wife, Stein Ingstad, was a trained archaeologist, and together they did something almost embarrassingly simple. They took the saga descriptions seriously as potential geography rather than pure myth, and they started asking local people along the coastlines of eastern Canada whether they knew of any unusual old structures. In 1960, at a place called Lance Ux Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, a local resident named George Decker showed them exactly what they were looking for: grass-covered mounds that locals had always assumed were old indigenous structures or natural formations. And Stein Ingstad's subsequent excavations, beginning in 1961 and continuing for years afterward, revealed something that stunned the archaeological world: the unmistakable foundations of Norse buildings. These were not vague signs. These were the actual architectural fingerprints of Scandinavian construction techniques, sod-walled longhouses built in a style found nowhere else in North America, but nearly identical to Norse structures excavated in Iceland and Greenland. Researchers found a small bronze cloak pin of a style worn specifically by Norse men. They found a stone oil lamp. They found evidence of iron production, a smithy where Norse settlers had smelted bog iron and forged nails, a level of metalworking technology that no indigenous culture in the region was using at the time, and one that left an unmistakable technological signature in the archaeological record. Radiocarbon dating placed the site firmly around 1000 AD, matching the saga timeline almost perfectly. And then, decades later, the dating got even more precise in a way that sounds almost too good to be true. In 2021, a team led by researcher Margot Quidams used a method involving a massive solar storm that struck Earth in the year 993 AD. This solar storm left a distinct radiocarbon signature in tree rings worldwide, a kind of global timestamp baked into the wood of every tree alive at that moment. By examining wood samples cut by Norse settlers at Lonseux Meadows and counting the growth rings outward from that signature year, researchers determined with remarkable precision that the wood had been cut in the year 1021 AD. Not approximately, not roughly, the exact year. This meant that nearly 5 centuries before Columbus's 3 ships left a Spanish port, Norse settlers were cutting trees, building structures, and very likely repairing ships on North American soil. Lonseux Meadows is now recognized as the earliest confirmed evidence of European presence in the Americas, a designation that fundamentally rewrote the opening chapter of post-Ice Age contact between the hemispheres. But here is where the story gets more complicated and more honest. Lonseux Meadows itself does not perfectly match the saga's description of grape-rich Vinland. Newfoundland's climate, even during the slightly warmer medieval period, was not conducive to wild grapes. This has led many researchers, including archaeologist Birgitta Wallace, who spent decades studying the site, to conclude that Lonseux Meadows likely functioned as a gateway camp, a base used for repairs, wintering over, and launching further exploration southward into regions that may have included the Gulf of St. Lawrence or even further down the coast, areas that better match the saga's description of a warmer, grape-bearing Vinland. In other words, Lonseux Meadows might not be Vinland itself. It might be the doorway to Vinland, evidence of a Norse presence that extended further into North America than archaeologists have yet been able to confirm with physical remains. Some researchers have proposed locations as far south as the Gulf of St. Lawrence or New Brunswick as possible sites of further Norse activity, though none have been confirmed with the same level of certainty as Lonseux Meadows. And then there is the question the sagas raise that modern archaeology has only begun to answer. Contact. The sagas describe encounters between the Norse settlers and indigenous peoples they called the Skrælings, a term whose exact translation remains debated but generally understood to mean something like wretches or barbarians, reflecting the cultural bias of the Norse narrators rather than any objective description. These encounters, according to the sagas, began with trade and ended in violence. The Norse, vastly outnumbered and far from any reinforcements, eventually concluded that permanent settlement was not sustainable, and the colony at Vinland, wherever its full extent actually was abandoned. This detail matters enormously, because it complicates a particular myth about the Columbus narrative just as much as it complicates the myth that no one reached the Americas before any European. The Americas were never empty land waiting to be found. They had been inhabited for over 15,000 years by sophisticated, populous, and highly varied indigenous civilizations by the time either the Norse or the Spanish arrived. The Norse encountered organized resistance precisely because the land was occupied by people capable of defending it. Their settlement failed not because of some inherent unsuitability of the land, but because the people already living there had both the numbers and the will to push them out. The Vikings did not fail to colonize North America for lack of trying. They failed because, unlike 5 centuries later, they showed up without the overwhelming technological and demographic advantages, including diseases the indigenous population had no immunity to, that would later allow European colonization to succeed catastrophically at the expense of native populations. So why does Columbus get the credit, the holiday, and the rhyme, while Leif Erikson gets a minor holiday most Americans cannot name? The answer lies less in what actually happened and more in what came after. The Norse voyages to Vinland were a remarkable feat of exploration, but they led to no lasting colony, no sustained contact, and critically, no chain reaction of further European settlement. They were, in the context of world history, a remarkable dead end. Columbus's voyages, despite Columbus himself dying convinced he had reached the outskirts of Asia, triggered something the Norse expeditions never did. Centuries of sustained transatlantic contact, colonization, and the violent, transformative collision of 2 hemispheres that had been separated for thousands of years. History does not always remember the first person to do something. It remembers the person whose actions changed everything that came after. But the soil at Lonseux Meadows does not care about historical significance or cultural memory. It simply holds the truth, preserved in iron slag and house foundations and the rings of trees cut down 1,000 years ago. Long before any Spanish ship crossed the Atlantic, Norse families were living, working, and eventually leaving North American shores. The next time you hear the date 1492, remember that it marks the beginning of permanent European presence in the Americas. It does not mark the first European arrival. That story belongs to a different people entirely, a story that was preserved not in textbooks, but in half-remembered sagas and the patient, stubborn work of 2 outsiders willing to take old stories seriously enough to dig. You learned the rhyme. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. But the real first chapter of this story was written nearly 500 years earlier, by people who arrived, built, struggled, and ultimately left, leaving behind nothing but foundations in the grass and a story almost no one believed until the proof was finally pulled out of the earth.